right, well, this morning we're continuing our series on the lost art of letter writing. But before I say that, I have to mention, man, if you've noticed, there are a lot of men, somewhere well over 100 men were at our man camp last week. And we spent the weekend hearing from Anthony Edwards, a pastor, and he's a chaplain for the Cardinals. And I love how he inspired our men and challenged them. Do we have enough men to try? Okay, so every man in here, you're going to have to help me out. So Anthony, like 10 times during his message, would stop and he would say, "Men of steel," and then all the men would respond with a booyah. I guess this happens in football, so I need every man in the room to help me out here. When I say men of steel, you're going to come back with a booyah, all right? Let's try this. Men of steel. Booyah. Ooh, men of steel. Booyah. That's really good, all right. Almost as loud as 100 guys in a small room. And anyway, so one of the things, not only did we hear from Anthony, but we had men like Vern Vanderloo brought up a pile of rangers and razors. And I have a clip here. And guys, here's what you have to realize. We can run this. Guys are just grown-up boys. That's all they are. They're just 9-year-olds in big people clothes. And so what happened here is Vern's in front of me and Anthony, and he stopped trying to get us stuck. And so I said, "Anthony, splash him. Just wait." And so that's what happens there. So that was what was happening, very spiritual at Man Camp. And that's what you missed if you weren't there. All right. So the lost art of letter writing. This morning we come to 2 Corinthians. We're going through each of Paul's letters that he wrote to the early church, and each week we want to pull out one critical piece of teaching and words of encouragement that he had. And so I want to look at chapters 8 and 9 this morning, and I want to talk about how God calls us to live this generous life, and that we are called to be a people of generosity. Let me say this before I read what Paul has to say. Sometimes when pastors or churches talk about giving or generosity, they do it because the giving isn't so good. And that's not the case right now at the Grove. Right now at the Grove, I want to pause and say thank you to men and women and individuals and families who have given so generously over the last few months. We've experienced this first quarter of the year, the most generous giving we've ever seen at the Grove in the history of the 12 years I've been here. And we can applaud that. And I want to say thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your sacrificial giving. And so many of you, I'm just here to applaud you and to encourage you. And if you're not part of this movement of generosity at the Grove, then this morning is a way to invite you in, because God has been and is doing something very special in our church. So open with me. I'm going to start in 1 Corinthians 8, and then I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians 9. We are the ones, not Paul, who put the chapter breaks in. They should be read together. And so we read this chapter 8, verse 1. "And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian church." So he's telling the church in Corinth about another church, and he's saying, live like them. Verse 2, "In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service." This is crazy what he's saying to the Lord's people. "And they went beyond our expectations." This is about the Macedonians, and he's saying, live like them. Now turn over a page in your Bible, chapter 9, verse 6. "Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, and God is able to bless you abundantly." Verse 9, "As it is written, they have scattered abroad their gifts to the poor." Verse 12, and I'll finish with this. "This service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God." He says all of these great things about the church in Macedonia, and because of their generosity, so many great things are happening in the name of God. And he's saying to the church in Corinth, we need you to give like this. So go back one page in your Bible to to chapter 8, and he says, I'm sending Titus to take this offering. And then we read this, verse 18, and we are sending along with him the brother. It doesn't say who the brother is, but to me, I'm just wondering, so I did some research, and I found out who this brother is. We read in certain ancient Greek manuscripts from Sicily, Vito Corleone is his name. I have a picture of him here, and he was sent along. This is my guess as to who the brother is. All right, we can move on. Just thought I would add that. All right, from Sicily. But he sends Titus to take this offering, and Paul's point is this. He says, you have been resisting generosity. But he says this church in Macedonia, something special and extraordinary is happening there. And he says, so I'm going to ask you to give. And he says, when you give, make it generous because God is using it. And it's an expression of thanksgiving to him. So I've done this experiment before, but I'm going to try it again because it didn't go so well last time. Some people held on to theirs. So I want you to take out your wallet or your purse out of your pocket. Your purse won't be in your pocket. But if you have a purse, hold on. Take it in your hand. And I want you to hold on to it with both hands. If you give with, what is it called? iMoney, Apple Money, iPay, Apple Pay. Then pull out your phone. And so do that. So whatever represents the money that you have. And for many of us, it's our wallet or our purse. Hold it in your hand. So I'm actually asking you to do this. Yes. So take it in your hand. And I want you to hold on to it with both hands. And go ahead and rub it gently. Because in many ways, this has become the temple of the 21st century, hasn't it? We seem to spend so much, a huge, almost majority of our time each week and month and year trying to fill this, don't we? And when it's empty, we feel worthless and powerless. When it's full, we feel powerful, don't we? And so we do all we can to fill it. It's almost like the temple. Are you still holding on? Hold on to it with both hands. Hold on to it tightly. Now, I want you to turn and look at the person to your left, all right? And my hope is look at them to your left and kind of size them up. Hopefully, you're related to them. Hopefully, they have not just been released from Tent City for pickpocketing, something like that. And I want you to hand them this wallet or this. I'm going to go left right here. All right. He's not going to take it. And I want you to hand it to them. You got to give me yours. You got to give me yours. He's giving me mine back. All right. So you have this other person's wallet or purse. Hold on. Don't leave. Some people are leaving right now. Don't leave. Now, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have our ushers come, and they're going to pass the offering bucket. And I want you to give like you've never given in your whole life. You guys think I'm kidding. All right, we're going to give that back, and you don't know who that, maybe you got it back. It's very uncomfortable, isn't it? Because we're just talking about money today, but it gets really weird, doesn't it? And uncomfortable. It gets personal. And Paul is trying to get the church in Corinth to relax and loosen their grip on their possessions and on their wallets and on their purse strings and live this generous life that is the best life. And so today, I want to talk about a way to be content. I want to talk about becoming debt-free. I want to talk about a way to live generously. I want to talk about a way to trust God with our possessions and even with our money. I have a key idea on the screen, and I just want you to look at it with me. Like the early church at the Grove, our desire is to grow a culture of generosity. And can I pause here and say, 5 years ago, I started writing about how this church is a generous church. And so if you're new here, then get on board this movement because it's happening. A church filled with people who share it all, trust God with their things, and give him their best. That's what we're talking about this morning. Living simply, trusting God, being able to live generously, and living content with the things that God has entrusted us with. So I want to do just something simple this morning in looking at chapters 8 and 9. Paul talks about the different qualities of the church of Macedonia. And he says, look at them and learn from them. And if the church in Corinth can learn from them, then so should we, this church. And so I want to pull out 5 qualities. There might be more here. I'm going to stop at 5. 5 qualities of generous people. And the first one that I have is generous people are super optimistic. Let me read verse 2, so we'll go back to where we began. And not only does Paul in 9:7 say, God loves a cheerful giver, but he starts in verse 2 by saying in chapter 8, out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. So Paul uses this really strange equation, this fascinating equation. He says they're in extreme poverty, but they're also a very optimistic and joyful people. And when you put that together, they become generous. You know, sometimes we think, when I have money, then I'll be generous. And that's not how it works. And that's not what we see here. When I talk about this, I can't help but think of a church in Ganta. You don't even know where Ganta is. Picture the most blighted, dusty, litter-filled African town that you can imagine. Goats and chicken and trash everywhere. It's a trading town. It's an intersection town between 2 major thoroughfares in Liberia. And I was there with about 35 people from the Grove, and we had divided up on a Sunday morning to about half a dozen different churches, and I had our people sharing stories and testimonies. And then in the afternoon, I started driving around picking up people from the Grove at these different churches. And this one church I stopped at to pick up your Grove people, they got in the van and they were blown away. They said, Palmer, we don't know what to say. They said the people, they knew we were coming, they had made shirts out of African material for all of us. And then they did this. These people in Africa, just coming out of a civil war, Palmer, they took an offering and they gave us the whole offering as a gift. And so these people are living in extreme poverty, and they're giving to our people at the Grove, who any one of them, their 1 week's salary is more than these people combined would earn in a year. And they gave to us, and in their poverty, they rose up and gave. Now, we turned around and we gave it to an orphanage down the road, but my point is a lack of funds is not a reason to not be generous. And so I said that generous people are optimistic. Generous people are hopeful in the sense that they see the world as God can make it. And then they know that if they're generous and they give their lives away and they give their possessions and their things away, that God will use it to change things in this world. I have a list here on the screen of things that happen in our lives when we start to live generously. Just think about this. You can write them down. But this is true. First of all, your life, when you start to give away and it scares you, your life becomes an adventure with God. You live less focused on yourself and more focused on others. Listen to this. It's true. You become less anxious about money and possessions because you're sharing it all. When you live generously, you love easier, you smile quicker, and your life fills with these incredible memories of the people that you've been able to impact because of your generosity. Well, here's the next word that I want to share with you is I have that generous people are altruistic. They are. Altruism is the act of sharing what we have, particularly with people who have less than we do, with the poor. But altruism is also this. It means that you expect nothing in return. And some people, they live generously or they give, but they want something back. And some people just don't care. And I think that's the most godly way to get. And so we read this in 2 Corinthians 9, verse 9. They have scattered abroad their gifts to the poor. They've shared it all. And it seems like they're expecting nothing in return. There's a woman, her name is Elaine Taylor. Elaine Taylor lives in Massachusetts, and just recently she went to a donut shop. The name of the donut shop is Heavenly Donuts. And for that matter, every donut shop should be named Heavenly Donuts. And it's just God's place. And so she's in this God's place, and no, she's actually going through the drive-thru. And when Elaine got to the window, she paid for her donuts, and she said, Could you tell me what the order is behind me? And she paid for their donuts. And what that put in motion was the next 55 cars in a row through the drive-thru paid for the people behind them. And you know what happens when you pay for the people behind you in the drive-thru? You never meet them. They never get to thank you. They don't buy you donuts back or coffee in return. You give without getting anything back. And my point is, generous people have no ulterior motives. Generous people simply give as a statement of their gratitude to God. And so if you look at chapter 9, verse 12, we read this: this service that you perform is also an overflowing expression of thanks to God. And so when you're generous, it's not because that you might get something back from God and He might bless you in return, but in many ways you're simply saying, God, I'm grateful for what you've given me. The next quality of a generous person, they're optimistic, they're altruistic. They also, they trust God with their things. So we read this in chapter 8, verse 3. I testify that they gave as much as they were able, even beyond their ability. I want you to think about that for a minute. Have you ever given beyond your ability? Have you ever given so much that it scared you? Have you ever given, you go, oh my goodness, how am I going to pay my mortgage or my rent because I was just so generous with this person or with this individual or with this church or with this place? Generous people trust God. You see, so much of the time when we give, especially when we give in church or to God, we hedge. We give out of our excess. We give with what's left over. We give what's safe. Let's be honest. We give what we can afford. But here's what sets generous people apart. The most generous people give beyond their ability, and they trust that God will take care of their needs, and it actually scares them. I think trusting God with our possessions is one of the great qualities of generous people. Generous people trust God. They trust that God has enough. Like I said, one of the lies that money tells us is that what is keeping me from being the most generous person is that I'm going through a tough time financially right now. And when I straighten that out, when I get that figured out, then I'm going to be more generous. That's what we tell ourselves. You know, money has a way of lying to us. And it says that the only reason that I'm not giving right now is because I'm broke and I'm in debt. And so as soon as God gives me more, I'm going to be super generous. Let me tell you, it doesn't work like that. I know that because I've been a pastor for about 27, 28 years. And sometimes I have people stop me and they say, you know, kind of guilty, like, hey, Palmer, just so you know, and you probably know already, I'm not giving anything to the church right now. Okay, first of all, I don't know what you give. I don't look at our giving records in your name. But they think I do, and they say, hey, I'm not giving now, but as soon as I get out of debt, or as soon as I get my business on its feet, then I'm going to be they'll tell me this, the most generous person in the Grove. You know, I'm just going to give so much, it's going to blow you away. You know what happens? I've seen a pattern. Those are the same people whose businesses fail. Those are the same people who end up filing for bankruptcy or losing their house or breaking their family. Because generosity has nothing to do with how much you have in the bank account. We have this interesting interaction in Mark chapter 12 between Jesus and people who are giving. So Jesus sets up a chair, it sounds like, next to a giving box. Like, all right, these are buckets we use sometimes. So we have giving boxes, and that's kind of what they had in the synagogue. And Jesus is sitting there, and in research we call it participant observer. And he's just watching people give, right? And so people are coming along, and he sees that the wealthy people are giving. And he turns to his followers, his disciples, and he says, they're just tipping God. They're just taking some loose cash out of their back pocket and dropping it in. And then this woman comes by, and she's a widow, and she's broke. And she drops in just like 2 cents, something like that. And he says, that's generosity, because she just gave it all. She's trusting that God will have enough for tomorrow. Do you see why I say generous people trust God? Generosity, I hope you get, it begins at what I'll describe as the soul level. It begins with this realization. So I need you to think about this and maybe write it down. Generous people understand, deep on the inside, they understand that what I own is not mine. Wow, that's hard for us to take in. What I own, the Bible keeps telling us, is actually God's. And he lets us be a steward of it and take care of it and invest it wisely and use it in his name to do great things. And so the question is, how are you doing at what he's entrusted you with? Are you holding on to it so tightly you can't pry it out of your hands? I have a friend named Brett Johnson, and years ago when he spoke here at the Grove, some of you may remember, he talked about his two sons. He has two sons, and any of you that have sons, we won't say daughters, but sons, this happens with often, as he said they went to a fast food restaurant, and of course he's trying to eat healthy, so he didn't order French fries like I do and a lot of you do. And as soon as they sat down, he started to reach for his son's French fries. How many of you fathers do that? All right, not mothers. All right, and some of you do that. And so he starts to reach, he says, and when I do, my sons always say, no, Dad, they're mine. And he said, I'll plead with them. Please, Kurt, just give me two. Could I just have? And they'll say, no, Dad, you're going to eat them all. You can't have two. And he says, what I'm saying on the inside, I want to scream out, hey, kid, I just bought those for you. That was my money. Those fries, you wouldn't have them if it wasn't for me. And then he says, I want to tell them that I have enough money in my wallet to buy you enough fries to make your stomach hurt. So just give me two fries. And they won't. And isn't it ironic? That's how it is with us and God. He gives us, he blesses us, and then he asks for us to use it well in his name, and then we hold on tightly. And so can I say, trust God with your money and your things? In Psalm 50, David makes this brilliant observation. He says this, he owns Psalm 50:10, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. You know, cattle was about the most valuable possession you could have. It's like a Bentley maybe. He says, but he owns those, and so think about that. He owns the condos on 1,000 beaches. He owns the cars in 1,000 dealerships. You know, he owns the money in 1,000 banks and counting. He owns all the donuts in Heavenly Bakery. He owns all of those. Heavenly Donut Shop. He owns all of those. But David's point is, when you give to God generously, don't be afraid that he doesn't have enough to give back when you need it and to meet your needs. Generous people trust God because they know that he always has enough. So then I want to say this next. Generous people, as we're talking about qualities of generous people share everything. So I want you to look at chapter 9, verse 11. Be generous on every occasion. And through us, your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. I love this first phrase. Be generous on every occasion. God gives you opportunities every week, almost every day. And maybe you've been holding back and it's time to form a new habit. Form a new habit and think about your things differently, would you? Years ago, I started in the pastorate as a junior high pastor, and we used to make runs from La Mirada, California, sometimes on Friday or Saturday night down to Huntington Beach. It's just 30-minute drive. And I remember calling one set of junior high parents, and I asked the father, I said, hey, I know you have a minivan, and could I borrow it this weekend for a junior high trip? And his answer was, yeah, and he stumbled. And he says, no, I'm sorry, you can't use it. The junior highers might poke holes in the upholstery with a pencil. And I have a picture of it here. I took a picture, actually. It's just an Astro minivan. I found this on the internet. But let's say it looked like that. And you want to go, it's just an Astro minivan. Give me a break, it's not that expensive. And he said no. And some people are like that with their things and with their money or with their time. But generous people learn to share everything. There's this, a recent study that was published in psychological science that demonstrates how toddlers, 3-year-olds, they had 112 3-year-olds, and they gave them suckers and candy. And then they had another kid that had none. And in this experiment, they wanted to see if they would share what they had. Toddlers at 3 years old share. We think they don't. We see our kids fight and bite each other's noses over things, but that's not the truth. Deep inside, they share. When they're alone, they found that over 80% shared of the toddlers. I even have a video here. Let's take 1 minute. It's just like a 1-minute video. Watch this and just listen to these kids.
Let's see. I'll help you. Here. We're going to take some photos, but the problem is the photographer is late. I'm going to look for the photographer, and then we'll take the photos. Meanwhile, you can have a snack, okay? Mm-hmm. I'm going to go, and I'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay? Here I go. Count to 3.
1, 2, 3.
Very awkward. One kid has one kid doesn't.
I don't know. This one or this one? This one. And let's do magic. The bigger one.
Don't give away the bigger one. All right, we can stop there. Isn't that interesting? These kids are alone in a room. And we think that kids don't tend to be generous, but they are. Do you know what researchers have found? Is that stinginess is a learned behavior. And we can learn from kids. We can learn from teenagers. I received an email this week, and I asked a young lady, her name is Callista. She goes to Perry High School, and I asked her if I could read her short email to you. So listen, it's just a paragraph long. She says, "My name is Callista. I'm a sophomore over at Perry High School. Today was my second worship service at the Grove. The first was Easter. I was listening to Pastor Paul talk about sharing your gifts today during the service, and I want you to know that I can help. Since, unfortunately, I cannot donate my money. I'm assuming there's not much of it." And she says, "I want to volunteer my time to my church." I love that. 2 weeks and it's my church. "I can help with children's services at the Grove Coffee Shop, singing in the main worship service, and volunteering my hard work helping to build the children's gray shell greenhouse, or for any other projects. If there are any ways that you think I could help to serve my Lord, please let me know. You can email me or shoot me a text." Callista. How do you like that? So we can applaud that spirit. Thank you. Because I think sometimes kids and even teenagers think different than we do. Generous people share everything. More than just money, they share their ability and their time and their possessions and the things they own. Here's the last one I want to share. The last quality and characteristic of generous people is that they are content. And Paul, I want to skip ahead to another letter that he writes to the church in Philippi. And let me read verses 11 and 12 from Philippians chapter 4. And you can read with me and mark this in your Bible. "I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. Whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want, I can do everything through him who gives me strength." So Paul says, "I have learned the secret of contentment." You know, I think maybe the greatest barrier to being generous people is that we live discontent, is that we never seem to have enough, is that we always want just a little bit more. I was with my relatives 2 weeks ago for a family reunion birthday celebration. I was talking to my brother-in-law, and we're talking about birthdays, and he said that the last week was his son's 7th birthday. And he says, Palmer, it was the funniest thing. Do you want to hear what we did? He said, I found in my basement a Barbie set. This is for us. He said, so I wrapped it up. He said, I thought it'd be so funny. And so he said, I wrapped it in wrapping paper. And it was the first thing he opened, this big, giant box. He said, but when he saw it was a Barbie set, he just started to cry. Big, giant alligators. And he just kept crying and crying. And so we made him open his other presents really quick so he had stopped crying. But his favorite one that he wanted, he told us, was the Lego set. But he opened that and he kept crying. And we said, why do you keep crying? He said, because the biggest one, I can't do anything with that. And so even though he got everything he wanted, there was a bigger one out there. And it was a horrible gift for a 7-year-old boy. And he wanted more. And we're all wired a little bit that way. I think we resist being generous people many times because we keep comparing ourselves to other people. There's an MIT professor who's done an interesting survey on gold medalists. By the way, let me say this first. We don't just compare ourselves to anyone. We usually compare what we have to people who have more. So I said there's an MIT professor, and he's done this fascinating study on gold and silver and bronze medalists, on Olympic medalists. So you have gold, medal, bronze. And it was research on levels of happiness. Now, who do you think was the happiest in his research? He found, first of all, the gold medalists were the happiest. Who do you think was the second happiest category? You're right, it was not the silver medalists. The bronze medalist was the second happiest. Do you know why? Because the bronze medalists did not compare themselves upwards. They compared themselves downwards. They looked at everyone in the field, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, who did not make it to the podium, but they did, and they're just going, I'm just happy to be here. You know, I'm happy to have something hanging around my neck. It can be any color you want. And they were the second happiest group. But do you know why the silver medalists were the third happiest group? Because they compared themselves upwards. They kept looking at the gold medalists going, that should be me. That guy's not there. That person, she's not as good as I am. I could beat her. I could beat him the next time. Just give me another chance. And they envy because they're looking up instead of looking at those who have less. And we forget, and that happens, that we forget and we take for granted all the things that God has given us. And we live dissatisfied, discontent lives. There's something really deep in the human heart here. And that money keeps telling us, look at people who have more. And people, generous people, live content with what God has given them. And generous people say this, I have enough. And I really want you to think about that statement. How much is enough for you? Maybe that's the greatest question that this generation needs to deal with and wrestle with and struggle with. How much is enough? How much money, how much house, how much car, how much things, how much clothes, how much shoes, how much is finally enough? I want you to struggle with that today and wrestle with that because generous people live content. Otherwise, we're on this endless treadmill of wanting more and spending more and getting more. And you cannot live as a generous person until you're finally content with what you already have. So can I tell you that generous people are content? I'll end with this as an example. By the way, Paul says this, I have learned the secret of being content. So at Wheaton College, where I was a college pastor years ago, there was a New Testament professor by the name of Gilbert Bilzekian. The students called him Dr. B. And Dr. B lived in Wheaton, just a couple of blocks from the college like I did, and he would walk to work almost every morning. And Dr. B said that on his walk to work one morning, he noticed that a neighbor had a new sign, like a plaque, in front of their house. And it had been beautifully painted with the name of the street and the street address on it. And Dr. B is from France, and he has this great appreciation for art and beauty. And so he was like, wow, that's stunning. Someone did a beautiful job with that. And he said he found himself each morning when he was leaving for work, he started looking forward to walking past that sign and appreciating the beauty of that sign and thinking, someone has just done a great job with this. And it made his morning. For weeks and weeks and weeks, this beautiful sign made his morning. And then he said one day he was walking past, and his mind did something to him. He said his mind spoke to him and said, Dr. B, why don't you have one of those plaques? That's what his mind said. And his mind, he said to him, Dr. B, you would be happier if you had one of those plaques, wouldn't you? Dr. B, if you had that plaque in front of your house, people would think, man, Dr. B has a great taste in art and beauty. And Dr. B must be making a lot of money at Wheaton College to afford a sign that nice. And he said, so after that morning, each time he walked by, he resented the sign. And now instead of looking forward to the beauty of it, he was envying it, and it made him agitated and irritated, and it made him dislike the people who owned the house. He didn't even know them, but he said he didn't like them now, because they had something that he knew he couldn't afford. He knew his wife would never let him spend the money on it. So he just lived in envy every morning, wanting to avoid looking at the sign. And then he said, after weeks of this, he's walking by, and God spoke to him this time. And God said, Dr. B, can't you just appreciate the beauty of what someone else has? Can't you appreciate something and admire something without acquiring it? Can't you thank God and be grateful for what God has given someone else rather than wanting it for yourself and for your own? And so he says he heard God saying, and he finally agreed. He said, I agreed that I would admire it without having to acquire that thing. And that we can admire the beauty, the ways God has blessed people around us without having to have it. And I'd ask you to start thinking about that in your life and contentment, because maybe at some point you found yourself looking at what someone else has, and you've wanted it. And so today, I hope this morning has been a reminder that if you want to live the way that Paul is calling us to and God is calling us to, then live optimistic and full of joy as you give. Live altruistic, not really expecting or trying to manipulate God in your giving. Trust Him with everything and share everything, and then live content with what He's given you. That's the challenge this morning.